Thank you anyway for, I gather I'm ready to go, for inviting me again to speak at the University of Victoria. I gave a lecture in June on social entrepreneurship, which I understand challenged a number of the students then, sparked lots of discussions and debates, some with me as well by email and so on. So I hope this lecture on sustainability will do the same. Let's begin. Okay, I'm trying to, there we go. Okay, what is the definition of sustainability? Because that's where you always have to begin by defining your terms. From the Oxford Dictionary, of course, the literal definition of sustainability is the ability to be maintained at a certain level or rate. They also imply that avoidance of the depletion of natural resources as a secondary alternative definition of sustainability. Of course, this defines what sustainability is, but not why necessarily it is of value. We need to explore that as well. Is it because we want to sustain, for example, as the Oxford Dictionary says, natural resources, energy, food, land, forests, oceans, atmosphere, all of the above, perhaps more? Important, yes, and in fact, I will be addressing some of these in this lecture, not all, we don't have time, but what is the first thing you should value and must be sustained above all else? That's really an ethical question. Why sustainability? The branch of philosophy, of course, that deals with philosophy. And many of you may know that I deal a lot with business ethics, which is why I'm introducing it here. That is to say, why do we in fact value sustainability? Well, the philosopher Ayn Rand supported that, answered that ethical question as follows. Life is a process of self-sustaining and self-generated action. It is only to a living entity that things can be good or evil. So what is the ethical answer to why sustainability? What is the first thing you should value and must be sustained above all else? Well, simply it's you. Your life in particular, human life in general. Therefore, throughout this lecture, the ethical principle for judging what is good from bad, what is of value and what is not, the answer to why sustainability will be sustaining human life. Now, the answer to why sustainability, of course, begs the next question. How do you do that? If sustaining human life is the thing you should value and be most sustained above all else, how best do you do that? Here are some answers commonly given. Well, let's reduce consumption. How about recycle, conserve natural resources, as the dictionary implied, renewable energies, perhaps reduce human population. These are the answers many would give. In fact, these are often the only answers many proponents of sustainability ever give. But none of them are the first and most important thing to the answer to the question, how? Again, the philosopher Ayn Rand answered that question as well. Man cannot survive except through his mind. He comes on earth unarmed. His brain is his only weapon. So you say, that's a bit abstract. So why is that important to understand? Well, actually, it's because in many ways, Mother Nature is not as mother as we might hope she would be. We are not fast enough to chase down game like a cheetah. You know, we have no teeth or claws to kill a lion. We have no hair to keep us warm like a buffalo do. Foraging basically barely kept primordial man alive, and of course it would be far from sufficient today. So the first and most important answer to the question how is to recognize that man's mind is man's means of sustaining his or her life. Ayn Rand elaborates on this fundamental idea of how by also stating, an inventor is a man who answers the question why of the universe and lets nothing stand between that answer and his mind. So there you have the why and the how, rather briefly summarized in one sentence. Therefore, the principles upon which I will be evaluating the pros and cons of sustainability are human life is the answer to why, and man's mind through innovation as the answer to how. It's why I've named this lecture Sustainability versus Innovation, Past, Present, and Future. Now, you might think so far, I'm a master of the obvious. I mean, really, I presume you would say, of course, we value human life and innovation. But stay tuned, as I will now discuss some of the applications of the principle of sustainability for sustainability's sake alone that have undermined human life versus how man has applied his mind to sustain it through innovation, which is what this lecture is all about. Let's begin on that. 2 centuries ago, around 1800, over 80% of the world lived in extreme poverty on the verge of starvation. In fact, some claim it was as high as 95%. Even when I was born, yes, I'm an old guy, I know how you all think, but not that old. Still, 50% of the world when I was born lived in extreme poverty, less than $3 a day on the edge of starvation. Guess what? Today it is less than 10%. That's a remarkable achievement for mankind over the last 200 years, and even during my lifetime. So how did that happen, right? Was it through the application solely of the idea of sustainability for sustainability's sake, or was it through innovation? Let's dig in that. Let's begin by comparing the application of the principles of sustainability versus innovations that played out over that time period in regards to the most basic of all human resources required to sustain life, food production. The idea of sustainability is actually not a new one. It goes back several centuries at least to a period of time in the early 1800s. One of the most prominent proponents of sustainability, particularly in regards to food production and population growth, was Thomas Malthus. You'll hear his name a lot throughout this lecture. The legacy of his argument remains to this day and calls for population reduction in defense of sustainability. It is referred to as the Malthusian catastrophe argument. If I was given a test, I would actually ask you that. I'm not. The Malthusian argument is based on the idea that population growth is potentially exponential, as you see in this chart, while the growth of food supply or other resources is linear, which ultimately will produce a Malthusian catastrophe. The sustainability solution Malthus proposed around 1800 had horrific consequences for both the Irish during the Irish potato famine in the middle of the 1800s and the East Indians during the several East Indian famines during the same period of time. The British Parliament, based on the Malthusian arguments, made the conscious decision, I emphasize the word conscious decision, to allow 1 million Irish and 6 million East Indians to die of starvation on the pseudoscientific grounds that their doom was inevitable. Might just as well let them starve. They could have provided food and fact relief. They actually had food, but again, made the conscious decision not to do so. So much for the Malthusian sustainability solution to sustain those people's lives. So what had actually occurred since then? Since 1800, the world population has risen almost 8-fold. That's the 8 green area on this chart. While those living in extreme poverty, less than $3 a day in today's money, the red area, as previously stated, has declined from over 85% to less than 10%, as this chart illustrates. Still some work to do, but that's an incredible achievement for humanity. That's what actually happened. How did it happen? What Malthus and others did not have faith in was how innovation would in fact solve the famine problem of the world. Let's investigate how innovation achieved that, past, present, and future. The first significant innovation in food production was recognizing the value of fertilizer. In 1843, a field called Broadbach was set aside at Rothamsted in Hertfordshire, hard to pronounce all those words, to determine the effect of manure fertilizer on crops. One half of the field was given manure, the other half was not. Each year, the manure half was productive, while the other half produced less and less as the soil became depleted of nitrogen. But unfortunately, of course, there's only so much manure to go around. Is that right? Well, some today would say that politics produces enough manure to sustain humanity indefinitely into the future. Sorry for the joke, but it's true. But back then, of course, when politics was much less prominent, recognizing the need for fertilizer was a significant first innovation. Therefore, finding new sources initiated a worldwide search for additional sources of fertilizer. In 1845, they founded in the Chincha Islands off Borneo and the Namibian coast of Africa, where guano had accumulated from over thousands of years, literally, from bird droppings, hundreds of feet thick. Within a few decades, hundreds of ships transported this fertilizer to farmlands around the world. However, by 1870, the guano fertilizer boom was over. They depleted it. It was succeeded by a boom in Chilean saltpeter mining as a new source of fertilizer. By the 1900s, even those mines started, however, to peter out. That is not a pun. It's actually the origin of the word, of the expression for something to peter out. So a new innovation was required, and fortunately it came just in time. In 1908, Fritz Haber discovered how to fix nitrogen from the air to make ammonia by reacting it with hydrogen in the presence of a catalyst under pressure. But the real credit for the useful application of Haber's invention goes to Karl Bosch, a research science at BASF in Germany. Bosch turned Haber's lab invention through numerous innovations of his own into a practical innovation, resulting in building a factory in 1913 at BASF to produce ammonia fertilizer by the ton on a large scale. Haber's invention and Bosch's innovation application stand as one of the greatest achievements of all time, for which they both received Nobel Prizes, Haber in 1918, Bosch in 1931. This process is called the Haber-Bosch process and is still used to this day, producing now 200 million tons of fertilizer annually, albeit more efficiently. So the side lesson from this for you business students from the collaboration of Haber and Bosch is that you do not have to be an inventor to be an innovator. And applying an invention as you can as an innovator yourself is as significant an achievement as the invention itself. Something to aspire to if you don't consider yourself to be a great inventor. You could still be a great innovator by applying it. Okay, moving on. Beyond the significant benefit of improving food production, however, there were many secondary benefits of all of this. As Matt Ridley says in his book, How Innovation Works, a great book for you all to read, if Haber and Bosch had not achieved their near impossible innovation, the world would have plowed every acre of possible land, felled every forest and drained every wetland, yet would be teetering on the brink of starvation. A very good book to read. There are several more I'll be recommending by others throughout this lecture that illustrates this point. But the innovations in food production didn't stop there. The next great innovations came in the field of genetic crossbreeding in the middle of the 20th century. A great deal of credit for this innovation goes to Norman Borlaug, with the selective crossbreeding of plants, wheat in particular, to improve output and resistance to disease, which doubled yields on the same amount of acreage, twice as much from the same acreage. Steven Pinker, in his book Enlightenment Now places Borlaug on his list of giga lifesavers for having saved 1 billion people through his innovations. This is how many people have been saved throughout this last century. However, the sustainability response from India in 1963 was less than supportive. As Borlaug himself wrote, when I ask about the need to modernize agriculture, both scientists and administrators typically replied, poverty is the farmer's lot. They're used to it. I was informed that the farmers were proud of their lowly status and was assured that they want no change. He thought in continuing, I didn't believe a word of it. Norman Borlaug. Borlaug gave his innovation response to such notions in his Nobel laureate lecture of 1970 by saying, man can and must prevent the tragedy of famine in the future instead of merely trying with pious regret to salvage. I like that last statement, merely trying with pious regret to salvage. You're going to hear it again. In spite of these successes, it did not stop another generation of Malthusians to make catastrophic predictions. Paul Ehrlich in the 1975's ecologist, famines of unbelievable proportions. Eric Hardin, environmentalist, feeding India was like survivors of a shipwreck, climb aboard an overloaded lifeboat. William and Paul Paddock even wrote a book on famine in 1975. Countries like India were so hopelessly headed for or in the grip of famine, these can't be saved nations will be ignored and left to their fate. Does this sound familiar? Does this sound Malthusian, in fact? It is. So suffice it to say, famines of unbelievable proportions never happened in India, in fact. Like Malthus, Ehrlich, and the others also proved to be wrong. Because Borlaug persisted, the Indian government finally conceded in 1965 to begin planting Borlaug's wheat. It was a huge success and spread throughout all of India and Pakistan. Within a decade, India and Pakistan were self-sufficient and production continues to rise to this day. These are the actual wheat productions for those countries in this chart. The achievements through the innovation to overcome death from famine and starvation during the 20th centuries have really actually been monumental in all of human history. Writing in 2000, the economist Stephen Devereux summarized the world's progress in the 20th century. The 20th century should go down as the last during which tens of millions of people died for lack of access to food, as this graph above shows the enormous decline. But innovation has side benefits as well. While sustainability does not produce innovation, innovation can in fact produce sustainability. For those advocates of sustainability, a very important point, which I am a supporter of. Between 1960 and 2010, the acreage of land needed to yield a given quantity of food had declined by 65%. Next, also the maximum extent of total agricultural land occurred in the 1990s and has declined since then, much to everybody's surprise. Today, the world literally produces 20% more food than the current population requires on even less land because of these innovations. But the future looks even more promising, even if, in fact, no new innovations were to occur. Well, even though they certainly will. As Michael Schellenberger writes in Apocalypse Never, if every nation simply raised its agricultural productivity to the levels of its most successful farmers, which already exist, global food yields would rise by as much as 70%. If every nation increased the number of crops per year to its full potential, food yields, crops would rise another 50%. That's an enormous increase in production, even above beyond what we already have. That will look something like this. Yields will literally double between now and 2050. By the middle of this century, the world will be feeding 9 billion people, which is what's expected, with more food from a smaller area of land than it fed 3 billion in 1950. But certainly there will be additional innovations. That's where we are now, but let's look in a little bit into the future, just a glimpse. Just one of the latest but most promising advances in innovation in this area has been through gene editing with CRISPR. As of mid-2019, there are literally over 500 gene editing projects in agriculture underway in China, 400 in America, 100 in Japan, let alone the other countries of the world. In summary, producing enough food to sustain the human population in the future should not be a problem. Sounds good, but wait a minute. Doesn't that future require a lot of energy and other resources? Well, yes, it will. So let's move to discuss another issue, natural resources in general, and then energy in particular. Again, past, present, and future. Remember, the Oxford Dictionary's definition of sustainability as it applies to natural resources. Avoidance of the depletion of natural resources. But here's a challenging thought, and most of my lectures are challenging. There's no such thing as natural resources. No, wait a minute. And that's a pretty bold statement. Let me continue. But the reason I state that is because if you think of more about it deeply, there really is only nature which provides raw materials. But these are not resources. A resource is something you can make use of to sustain and improve life, human life. Wait a minute, there you have it again, that ethical standard I've been talking about. A resource is something that sustains and improves your life. What stands between nature and it becoming a resource to sustain life and innovation? Innovation is what transforms something of little value from nature into a resource of value to humans. As Robert Zerbin states in The Case for Space, our resources are growing, in fact, not shrinking, because resources are defined by human creativity. In fact, there is no such thing as natural resources, as I just stated. There are only natural raw materials. It is human ingenuity that returns natural raw materials, in fact, into resources. With that understanding, let's turn our focus to the most important resource of all to sustain man's life, energy, and how natural raw materials became valuable energy sources. Let's go back, way back in time here, and look at the history of energy from sustainability versus innovation perspective. Throughout all of human history, humans have been burning wood for heat and light. We even do it today in some of our fireplaces. Remember, we don't have enough hair to live in cold climates. Canada is a pretty cold place in the winter. Now, albeit a few Canadians seem to be attempting to adapt somehow. However, it's not yet clear whether this adaptation will prove this Canadian's ability to survive better or simply eliminate him from the genetic pool. I have my doubts. But for the rest of humanity, wood as the primary source of energy was sufficient and sustainable for literally tens of thousands of years, until in England in the 1500s, the unthinkable started to happen. They started to run out of wood. It was determined that with population growth, burning wood would soon deforest all of England. Other European countries came to the same conclusion and faced the same problem. Imagine if the principle of sustainability alone for sustainability's sake had been applied then. We might all still be living as peasants, if we were alive at all, sitting around wood fires, burning only as much wood as we could grow. But, of course, they didn't, fortunately for us. Instead, many went in search of new lands with, in fact, more wood, which is all they knew at the time. It is one of the reasons in the 1600s and thereafter, many from all over Europe came to the Americas, including Canada, where there were found vast forests. But for those that remained in England during the 1700s and many other countries, more so thereafter everywhere in the world, they needed another solution or literally freeze to death. And a good thing Malthus wasn't born then, as he may well have advised letting large masses of people to freeze to death to literally save the forests. They solved the problem by burning more coal than wood. Cutting wood and burning it for heat and light is relatively straightforward. Again, humans have been doing it for millennia. However, the process of mining coal is not so easy and itself demanded considerable innovations. Development of mining tools, pumps to remove water from mines, which was involved with steam engines, machinery to transport coal from source to consumers. Innovation solved all of these problems to allow coal to become a new source of energy for the humans. More importantly, though, and most importantly, coal powered the great industrial revolution, precipitating countless innovation, enhancing human flourishing on truly a grand scale. However, burning coal didn't come without problems. Burning coal caused new problems in the 1800s from air pollution, obviously. In fact, it was Herman Melville in 1849 that first compared London's fog to pea soup for their dense yellow appearance. Thus originated the expression, which maybe some of you have heard, pea souper, that remains to this day. Now, to help remedy that problem, there came the next great energy innovation in the 1800s, oil. However, the first use of oil was not crude oil pumped from the ground, nor was it used to replace coal and wood for heat, but rather for light. And while coal, oil, and even natural gas were sources for light, whale oil, in fact, was preferred. By 1840, more than 700 whaling ships with nearly 25,000 crewmen hunted whales, some species to near extinction. Surprising the whales survived at all. At that rate, whale oil was certainly never going to be a sustainable resource. Fortunately, again, for mankind and for the whales in particular, as well, I should say, not in particular, innovation came to the rescue. In 1855, Benjamin Silliman, a professor of chemistry at Yale, analyzed a batch of crude oil. After distilling and purifying it, he found that it yielded kerosene, a better oil for light than whale oil. Thus began the great oil boom when in 1859, Drake drilled the first oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania. Remember, as I stated previously, oil is not a natural resource, as it has no value as it comes out of the ground, which is why it is called crude. It was, in fact, John D. Rockefeller who did for oil what Bosch had done with Haber with fertilizer by orchestrating the innovations necessary for the mass production and distribution of kerosene from crude oil. But even that innovation didn't last long, as kerosene lighting was soon replaced with what? As we all know, electric lighting. No, Thomas Edison did not, in fact, invent the first light bulb, even though he's quite often credited for doing so. There were many other inventors worldwide who invented it before him or around the same time. Thomas Edison's real innovation, backed by J.P. Morgan, was creating the Edison Electric Company in 1889 for generating and distributing of DC electricity to energize all of those light bulbs. They didn't, in fact, work with motors at that time. And even then, Edison's innovations were soon surpassed by their competitors, Nicholas Tesla and George Westinghouse, who developed AC electric lighting and motors, which in fact is what we still use to this day, AC electricity. Innovation, challenge innovation to progress. This ushered in, of course, a world new era of energy in the 20th century in the form of electricity. This of course, demanded even more innovation to generate it, initially, for the most part, from fossil fuels using coal, oil, and natural gas. But you'd be interested to know, from a historical perspective, electricity was also generated by hydroelectric dams. In fact, the first hydroelectric dam was built in 1882, even before the first energy power plant by Edison at Fox River in Appleton, Wisconsin. And of course, wind power has been used for centuries to drive windmills. But believe it or not, the first windmill to generate electricity of scale was built in Cleveland, Ohio in 1888. That's a long time ago. But here's something that's even more surprising when I found this out, is Charles Fritz installed the first photovoltaic array, solar panel, even earlier on a rooftop in New York City in 1884. And guess what his reason was for doing it? According to Wikipedia, he did it because the early development of solar technology starting in the 1860s was driven by an expectation that coal would soon become scarce. Isn't that amazing? Concerns about sustainability drove innovators even back then to find yet new resources. While power generation in all its forms drove many innovations during the first half of the 20th century, it took another 60 years before the next innovation in generating electricity would occur in the form of nuclear power. In fact, the first nuclear reactor to generate electricity was in 1948. That's around the time I was born, by the way, at the X-10 graphite reactor in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, in the United States. This brings us to the present day. Here's a bit of a summary of it, which maybe you already know. Of the sources of energy production today, renewables, which include wind, solar, and biomass, is about 5% worldwide. Nuclear, 4%, hydro, 6%. Coal, gas, and oil collectively represent still about 85% of the energy mankind uses every second of every day. This lecture, the electricity being used to it, is being produced this second. And it always is second by second. And this energy has produced an unprecedented improvement in the standard of living in the world today by virtually any measure. Life expectancy, GDP, poverty, war, democracy. This is what energy has increased the standard of living worldwide. But it has created some problem as well, hasn't it? We all know this. We all accept this. Pollution, CO2, emissions, nuclear waste, even land use from renewables, solar, wind, and hydro. They don't come for free. What was sustainability response to this? Well, you'd be interested to know in the 1970s, when I was a university student, like many of you, that's how far back I go, we were told climate change was going to produce a global catastrophe as well. I actually worried about it at the time. We were told global cooling. Okay, here are just a few of the Malthusian predictions back then. 1970, ice age by 2000, Boston Globe. 1971, new ice age coming, Dr. Rasul, Columbia University. 1974, another ice age, The Guardian. 1978, no end in sight for 30-year cooling trend, New York Times. Well, when that didn't happen by the 2000s, we didn't get away for free. We got a new set of predictions. Warming now, okay. 1989, rising sea levels to obliterate nations by 2000, the Associated Press. Children won't know what snow is, the Independent in 2000. 2008, Al Gore warns of ice-free Antarctic or Arctic by 2013. 2012, Bill McKibben, decades of ungoverned fossil fuel and we burn up. Wow, burn up. Now that's a pretty dramatic statement. But of course we didn't burn up. In fact, as Aleph Eckstein discusses in his book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, deaths from climate-related causes have declined by 96% in the last 100 years. Oh, wait a minute. Let's repeat what that means. That's great. Global climate deaths, which have been recorded for the last 100 years from floods, droughts, storms, wildfires, and extreme temperatures, has in fact declined 96% from 1920 to 2019, 100 years. Still, of course, it would be ridiculous to claim humans have no impact on the world in general or climate in particular that creates problems. Of course it does. We all know that. We all accept that. However, it would be equally ridiculous to believe innovation can't solve any of these problems. And this is the key point I'm trying to make here. Not trying to deny anything, trying to solve it. I could give several hour lectures on this subject alone, but of course we don't have time. If interested, here are another 2 books on how innovation can solve and propose to solve many of them. Apocalypse Never by Michael Schellenberger, False Alarm by Bjorn Lomborg. The short summary of these books is that there are in fact innovative solutions, as there always has been, to solve human-caused problems, climate in particular. As this lecture has already illustrated a number of times, every human advancement has created new problems. But new problems could also be viewed as new opportunities for those willing to solve them through innovation. But of all possible solutions, we must reject Malthusian solutions. We must reject as allowing millions to suffer and die, as Borlaug rejected it by stating, trying with pious regret to merely salvage where we are. And how do we predict what those future innovations will be? As Peter Drucker recommends, the best way to predict the future is to create it. So let's look at some future promising innovations from people working now to create that future and solve those problems. Just a sampling, there are many. If you want to solve problems of current energy production and reduce CO2 emissions, what many claim, nuclear energy has to be a part of it. And small modular reactors are one of several very promising innovations. This small modular reactor from NuScale produces 60 megawatts, this is an example, of continuous power and is no bigger than 2 school buses. That's small. There are those building even smaller. How does this compare to a solar array or even wind turbines? Not that I'm against solar array or wind turbines, I'm just making this comparison. A 60 megawatt small modular reactor is represented by this small dot of land in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, barely distinguishable. Compare that to an equivalent 60 megawatt solar array, which literally requires 360 acres of land. Or compare that to an equivalent 60 megawatt wind farm, which requires 5,100 acres of land. These are all well-known statistics. You can find them anywhere. More importantly, a small modular reactor provides power continuously, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, subject maybe to maintenance shutdowns, where solar and wind are intermittent and provide on average 4 hours a day of generally continuous electricity. Therefore, and you don't often hear that, but for a fair comparison of total capacity produced, you would literally need to multiply the previous landfills by 6. And that's a very big footprint, not one that we can't do or can't use, but a big footprint. And while talking about footprints, what about the materials even to produce those solar panels and wind turbines, which if we depend on for 100% of our energy needs would require, according to Robert Zurban, mining of epic proportions. And then after 25, 30-year lifespan, the landfill to bury what can't be recycled, like wind turbine blades is one example, which are not recycled, also creates a problem. Although this might in fact present an opportunity for some of you to provide a solution to use some of those materials. In fact, I saw somebody who's creating a bit walking bridges from them right now. That's not a bad idea. Anyway, it is not like current nuclear reactors don't have problems as well, right? After all, nuclear reactors have a recycling problem as well with radioactive waste, one that seems to be manageable so far, but it's not a small problem. But perhaps that represents yet another opportunity for future innovation that you can participate in, which is exactly why Bill Gates backed innovator Nathan Myhrvold by investing $500 million in TerraPower to design a nuclear reactor that does just that, reuses spent fuel. They're not going to store it, they're going to reuse it. In fact, there is already enough spent nuclear fuel in storage using this new generation of reactors to meet the world's power needs for the next 1,000 years. That's a really nice innovation. I hope they can move forward with it. But nuclear, just looking to the future again, nuclear may even itself only be a stepping stone, as oil and gas and wood and all the previous ones into the future. The quest for the Holy Grail, truly the Holy Grail, lies in development of a fusion reactor which can produce unlimited zero emission power that is truly sustainable, not just for the next 1,000 years, but indefinitely into the foreseeable future. And how far into the future as that might be? As Matt Ridley are they away from here, from being developed? As Matt Ridley states in his book, How Innovation Works Again, the old joke that fusion power is 30 years away, and it has been for 30 years, may at last fulfill its promise and begin to provide almost unlimited energy within the next few decades. There are several government research organizations, at least 8 private companies working on the development of a fusion reactor. In fact, one, General Fusion, is located right here in Vancouver, BC. They hope to be the first. Predictions for the future, of course, of energy, to me, are not impossible to solve and look promising. But remember, we need sufficient energy to get to that future, to provide the heat, light, and electricity for those innovators, hopefully for you, to produce those future innovations. As Robert Zurban states in another of his books, Merchants of Despair, with sufficient energy, you can make anything. Without it, you can do nothing. I have discussed how innovation overcame sustainability concerns in 2 areas, food and energy, over the past 2 centuries, and how promising they are for the future. And recall what I stated in the beginning is the most important thing of all to sustain, and why? Human life in general, your life in particular. But some would argue that ultimately that is the real problem, population growth. What happens if the population continues to grow? Malthus may have been wrong in the 1800s, and Ehrlich may have been wrong in the 1900s when he wrote his book entitled The Population Bomb. But if the population keeps on going up, 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 isn't in fact the Malthusian catastrophe inevitable sooner or later? I mean, really, that's an interesting question. So let's look at population growth as the last subject I'll cover, because I only got 5 minutes, if there is any merit to that concern. Hans Rowling, in his book Factfulness, has a test he has given to tens of thousands of individuals, including Nobel laureates, professors, political leaders, and business executives worldwide. Here's one test question in regards to population. See what your answer would be. There are 2 billion children in the world today aged 0 to 15 years old. How many will there be in the year 2100 according to the United Nations? 4 billion, 3 billion, 2 billion. Again, 2 billion children in the world today, 0 to 15. How many will there be in the year 2100? The answer is C, 2 billion. That's right. According to the UN, which doesn't make particularly cautious, predictions, there will be the same number of children under the age of 15 in 2100 as there are today. But if you didn't get that right, don't feel bad. Only 16% of the world's leaders got it right as well. This doesn't bode well for world leaders because if you gave the test to a group of chimpanzees, you could only guess 33% of would have gotten it right. So hopefully you did. I hope you're better than the chimpanzees. The worst case scenario, which in fact isn't that bad, predicted by the UN, is the population will level off at 11 billion around 2100. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, which you may have heard because of the biggest institute on predicting a lot of the COVID stuff, predicts the population will top out at under 10 billion 2064 and then in fact start to decline. The population won't grow because of more birth because we will live longer. That works for me even though I won't make it to 2100. Whereas the current prediction is that 1/2 of you actually will. I predict in the future, sustaining the number of people will be the greater challenge for you. Not too many, too few. This is already happening in many developed countries of the world, Canada, US, and other Western countries in particular. Now contrast that with projected GDP growth per capita, which is expected to grow by over 300% by 2100. That's right. You're not only going to live longer, but richer. Lucky you. But only if you allow innovation to create that prosperity. For with prosperity comes population control in underdeveloped world countries as they become more prosperous, as it already has in the developed countries in which we are all fortunate enough to live in. In closing, I hope I have demonstrated why innovation is essential for sustaining human life and how it has done so in the past, present, and is the correct path into the future. But it does leave one final question to be answered. Who is going to produce all those future innovations? Who's going to be the next Haber, Bosch, Borlaug? Well, there's only one answer to that question, you. You cannot default on the responsibility to sustain your life or you will not survive, or humanity will not survive. Be the next great innovator. Be the next giga lifesaver. So I leave you with the same challenge that the hero John Galt pronounced in Ayn Rand's famous novel, Atlas Shrugged, which I all recommend you read if you're going to be in Beak Business School in particular. The world you desire can be won. It exists. It is real. It is possible. It's yours. So in closing, to achieve that, you must remain free to innovate. Human innovation and the freedom to innovate are the only resources that really need to be sustained, not necessarily sustainable resources for the sake of sustainability. That's the end. I thank you. If you have any questions or so on, we got a little bit of time, not much. I think I've hit my mark on precisely. objectiveentrepreneur@gmail.com. Thank you for your time.